It's finally here. Today you will learn how to eliminate the passive voice in your writing to include a more active voice in everything you say. And during this lesson you should probably grab any of the past papers that you've done for the class, and of course you're looking for those PASS marks on the papers. So if you want to take a moment to do that, you can pause the playback or just find them as we go along. So you're looking for every sentence that contains the PASS mark, and you should see that written above a two-part verb, at least a two-part verb, underlined. So while you're looking at those examples, let's go on with the definition. The passive voice, here's your definition. This is a sentence where the subject does not act the verb shows action being done to the subject. Now the definition presumes, of course, that you remember the basic structure of every sentence, and that is that it contains a noun and a verb, and of course we call the noun the subject and the verb the predicate, but we're talking about the relationship between those two. So in a regular sentence, something like I read the book, I is the subject and read is the verb, and of course the subject I is doing the reading. But take a look at this one. The car was driven down the street. In this sentence, the verb is was driven, and the subject is car. Now you can see that in this case, car is not driving itself. Something is driving it. Hence the passive voice. So you have a sentence where that subject is receiving the action, not doing it. There are a couple characteristics to remember about the passive voice. The passive verb in the passive voice always contains two parts. Now it can contain more than two words, but it always contains two parts. And those two parts, let me show them for you here. Oh, that didn't work quite so well. Sorry, hold on a second. There we go. Two parts are some form of the verb to be, this is the simple past, and a past participle. In this case we have the verb driven, past participle of to drive. So you combine those two together, was driven, every single passive verb in every single sentence will contain those two parts. Now notice that some forms of the verb to be are multiple words, such as will have been. So if we change the tense of this to say the car will have been driven down the street, we still have a two-part verb. Some form of the verb to be and a past participle, it still qualifies as the passive voice. Now we got to think about how to revise this. Well, a number of different revision strategies exist, and I'll show those to you in a moment, but let me show you a possibility for the revision of this sentence. John drove the car down the street. Now with this new sentence, John is a new subject, wasn't in the original, and the verb is drove, so it's the same verb, just modified to fit the subject. So John is driving. This is now written in the active voice. The car drove down the street is another option, although not quite sure that this is the best option because, of course, cars can't drive themselves. So let's change this to a better verb. That looks a little nicer. The car rumbled down the street. Now we have a nice active verb, rumbled. The car is doing it, so once again, this is written in the active voice. This is not the passive voice. Three different ways exist to revise the passive voice, but before you get to revision, you must be able to identify. Don't forget that every passive verb contains two parts, a form of the verb to be and a past participle verb. Do not think that a form of the verb to be means a form of the verb to have. So if I say, John had driven the car, this may look like passive voice. You have two parts. So let me show them to you. You have the verb had and the verb driven, past participle right here. So you might think, well, that's a passive voice verb, but remember, this is a form of the verb to have, not a form of the verb to be. Therefore it doesn't qualify as the passive voice. And furthermore, if you look at it, John is driving the car. That's just that he's not driving it right now. He is driving it in the past. So past tense is not the passive voice. Just stick with these two qualities. A form of the verb to be, past participle verb, and you've got it. Now, on to revision strategies. You can revise the passive voice in three different ways. And it depends upon the sentence. You can't always use every single revision strategy. With some sentences you can use one, some sentences you can use two, but generally you cannot use all three. The first one we saw in that example, we could have seen in that example had the sentence been written, the car was driven by John. That's where you take the subject and there's an acting noun and the predicate, and you flip them. So let me show you this. The car was driven by John. That's passive voice. And I've got the subject of car. I've got John over here in a prepositional phrase preceded with by. So if you see this, and remember in this revision you must have the verb or the preposition by. So when you see the by, quite often whatever follows the by is your acting subject. So all you have to do is flip. There you go. Now it's no longer passive. John is driving the car. That's the first and easiest revision, but it's rare because you must have a by phrase. Number two, you find out what the acting subject is, reinsert it into the sentence as the acting subject. So in that first example, the car was driven down the street. We don't know what the acting subject is because it's not in that sentence. So we've got to determine what the implied acting subject is. If we determine that that implied acting subject is John, then we have the revision John drove the car down the street. But it's not there yet. We must find it. The third possibility is keeping the same subject but changing the verbs so that the subject now acts. And that was the case with the car rumbled down the street. We've kept the subject. We still have the car, but we've changed the verb rumbled, and now the car is actually doing that action. So once again, we have eliminated passive voice. It is now written in the active voice. One of these three revision options should work. Now, if you try all three and you find out that none of them is working, then you could, of course, just rewrite the entire sentence, gut the thing. Try to express yourself in a different way with a different sentence if nothing else serves. Also, when you are working with the passive voice and trying to eliminate it, don't forget to use the technology to your advantage. Microsoft Word's grammar check will check and find almost all instances of the passive voice in your writing. Let me show you how to do that with Microsoft Word 2007. Here's an example with some passive voice verbs. So the book was read by the student and how many tricks are played each Halloween. You'll notice the underlining with the sentences. That's because I've turned on Microsoft Word's grammar check to look for passive voice. You can do that up here in the Office button, going to Word Options, taking a look at Proofing, going down here to Grammar and Style Settings, and then as you scroll down you can see passive sentences right there. I know it's probably pretty small on the screen, but turn that on, click OK, make sure it's checking for grammar and style, and you can recheck the document and it should find them. Now Word can actually revise some of these on its own. Which ones? The one with the simple by. If there's a by phrase, revision strategy number 1, then right-clicking on this will show you the revision. The student read the book. Pretty easy. However, with this, where we don't know what the subject of that verb is, it simply says consider revising, and we don't know exactly how to revise it. Word can't tell us. But still, you should be smart enough to revise it on your own. What you probably need is Microsoft Word's help in finding all of these in your writing. Once you're aware of the passive voice and aware of how to turn this tool on, you should be able to find every instance and eliminate them pretty easily. So the passive voice is not all that difficult to find considering today's technology, and with a little bit of practice you can revise them with one of those three strategies and eliminate the passive voice and only use it when you absolutely want to.